Good afternoon, and thank you for joining us today. I'm Pam Strickland, your moderator. I serve on the leadership team of the North Carolina Demand Reduction Task Force, and I am the founder of North Carolina Stop Human Trafficking. I invite you to introduce yourselves in the chat box. You can give your name, your agency if you have one, and your location. You might find that there are colleagues close to you that you want to make contact with in the chat box. As we are going through today, if you have questions, please put those into the Q&A. And after our three presenters have spoken, then I will go through the questions at that time. I'm going to share my screen. Oops, sorry. So I have introduced myself, and our three presenters today are Trent Taylor, who is an attorney and a farm worker advocate, Carol Brooke, who is a senior attorney with the North Carolina Justice Center, and Christine Shaw Long, who is the executive director of the North Carolina Human Trafficking Commission. I want to take a moment to share the purpose of the North Carolina Demand Reduction Task Force. Our vision is a state in which there is no demand for exploited persons. Our mission is to create and execute a comprehensive statewide plan to reduce demand for the services of exploited persons. And our goal is to launch an effective demand reduction plan to address both labor and sex trafficking based on available evidence and best practices. So last year, many of you are aware we hosted a webinar series about sex trafficking and the role that demand plays in exploiting people for sex. This year, our focus is on labor trafficking and the role that demand plays in exploiting people for labor. So far in this series, this is our final one, we've talked about labor trafficking and supply chain transparency in broad terms, an introduction to that. We've met three survivors that shared their perspective on labor trafficking. 2 weeks ago, we were very pleased to have Nathan Prater, the ethics director of Ahold Delhaize, which is the owner of Food Lion and a lot of other grocery stores. And he was sharing their efforts to keep their supply chains from including exploited labor. Took a break last week. Hope everyone had a good Thanksgiving. And today, our final session, we'll discuss the elements of a statewide plan that reduces the demand for labor trafficking. In this finale webinar of the Labor Trafficking Webinar Series, we're putting it all together to unpack what foundations need to be laid for the state of North Carolina to have a comprehensive and effective plan to reduce demand for labor trafficking. This discussion welcomes a panel of experts who work in North Carolina addressing labor trafficking from advocacy to policy. And so first, I'd like to welcome Trent Taylor. Take it away, Trent.
Hi, thank you so much for the introduction, Pam. I wanted to take the time today to discuss and present on 3 remedies that I think can help prevent human trafficking in North Carolina, as well as other states. But before getting to that, for those of us who have some basic familiarity with economics, the counterpart to demand is supply. So whenever there is a shortage of workers who are willing and able to perform certain tasks, then the demand is going to go up and they're going to seek out other means for it. So with that as a preface to, the motivations behind labor trafficking, and why it is relatively prevalent. I will jump into kind of a statistical background. I currently work and represent farm workers, as Pam has mentioned, and trafficking is pretty prevalent in the industry of agriculture in comparison to other industries. Generally, labor trafficking is most prevalent in those low-wage industries, and agriculture is consistently ranks at the bottom with respect to wages and compensation. So it's not surprising that we do see a higher instance and occurrence of trafficking in agriculture. Recently, there was a study performed by Daniel Costa of the Economic Policy Institute. And this wasn't just an investigation of, or concerned just investigations of labor trafficking, but it concerned violations, all types of labor violations that were inspected and investigated by the Department of Labor within agriculture. And that study found that only 1%, approximately 1% of agricultural employers were ever investigated for suspicion of any violation, or whether it be, just a routine investigation, or a targeted investigation, or a investigation based upon a complaint. So there's very little enforcement out there. And what they found, however, was that in more than half of the investigations, there had occurred at least one violation. In many of their investigations, they found more than one violation. What that says to us is that for many employers in agriculture, and as well as other low-wage industries, the same evidence will bear out, is that it's simply a cost of doing business to violate the law. And because the chance that an employer may be caught is very minuscule, and then the penalties that they are forced to deal with or pay out as a result of being caught really are outweighed by what they would have to pay economically in order to comply with the law. Of course, there are many good employers out there who comply with the law because it's the right thing to do. But it should be the purpose of the law to make it a disincentive to violate the law rather than an incentive to violate the law. So with that, I'm going to jump into the remedies that I think would help stop and reduce the prevalence of trafficking in North Carolina. I will preface this by saying that I worked on legislation while I was an attorney with the Kentucky Equal Justice Center in Kentucky in 2012. And we were able to successfully pass a Kentucky state counterpart to the Federal Trafficking Victims Protection Act. And there were a number of provisions that were included that kind of bolstered the enforcement and the remedies that are available to trafficking victims. And so a lot of my experience comes from, or a lot of my perspective comes from that experience. But that being said, I think the important thing is that that the enforcement scheme be stepped up in assessing harsher and more severe penalties for those who violate trafficking provisions. Right now, that same Department of Labor investigation revealed that even though the Department of Labor was aware of many violators, it was still rare for them to impose any debarment or suspension of the business licenses of those involved. This, of course, the failure to do so creates an unfair playing field for those who choose to comply with the law. So they're undercut by businesses who, take the cheap way out and the immoral way out by engaging in trafficking practices. So that's definitely something that should be addressed. The second remedy that I would suggest is that law enforcement should be educated and trained to, rather than identifying trafficking victims as violators of the law, but treat them instead as potential witnesses, complainants, and actually victims of violations of the law. Now, this is something we see commonly, or a problem we see commonly in the arena of sex trafficking, and it was something that we dealt with when I was working on this legislation in Kentucky, is that many times there would be persons engaged in prostitution, and they would be arrested even though they were the ones being exploited. They had been trafficked. They were placed under horrible conditions. And as a result of that, many people were reluctant, if not completely opposed to speaking up about instances of trafficking. And so kind of the decriminalization of the offenses that a trafficking victim may be unwillingly cooperating in as part of the trafficking scheme is very important. And there needs to be education to law enforcement about that, and a change in their priorities of their enforcement tactics. In the arena outside of sex trafficking, for example, with agriculture, often those who are victims of trafficking are afraid to speak up because it will harm their immigration status. There are a number of communities which have enacted with the 587G provision, which they turn over anybody who reports a crime or who's involved in a crime to the DHS, for them to the Department of Homeland Security, for them to be processed as a potential violator of the immigration rules. That is adversely affects and is inconsistent with the mission of preventing labor crimes and violations in the state. And it's something that should be discussed and reformed within the state of North Carolina, as well as other states. And then the final thing that I would suggest, which is probably a big ask, but it's very important to assuring that there's compliance with the laws and that employees are able to speak out. And when they're able to speak out, that of course increases compliance and serves as a deterrence for those people who want to, or those bad actors who want to use trafficking as a tool to reduce labor costs or to obtain labor without consent. And that is the remedy that I'm proposing, is just like many states and many localities provide relief and support for victims of sex crimes or domestic violence, including rehabilitation services, counseling services, and a place to stay, so they can get back up on their feet after they've been a victim of abuse or exploitation. There should be some sort of option or resource for those who are victims of labor trafficking, especially when we're talking about trafficking victims who are coming from outside the United States. So they're placed in a particularly precarious position because if they leave their job, they often lose their employment status if they're on a temporary visa. For example, we have H-2A visas, which cover temporary migrant seasonal agriculture workers. If they leave their employment, then they're automatically out of status. And that means they either are going to be, picked up by immigration, or they have to find a way back home to their country. And most of the times they don't have any resources to pay for that travel or to secure employment that would allow them to finance their travel back to the United States. And then in the case of undocumented workers who are working in the United States, they have a similar fear, and they are pressed by the fact that once they leave their job, that might be the only job that they can get at that time. So already being underpaid, it does not make financial sense, or not even just financial sense. It does not enable them to get out of the trafficking situation and to report these crimes. So those are my 3 suggestions. If there's question time afterwards, I'd be happy to answer, but I'll pass it on to our next panelist.
Trent, thank you so much for sharing that. Our next panelist is going to be Carol Brooke. So I will turn it over to you.
Thank you, Pam. Let me share my screen here. And hopefully that is showing up for everyone. Yes? Wonderful. Yes. Okay. Let me move us through here. I am going to be speaking about a fairly narrow topic, which has to do with preventing the demand for trafficking among farm workers who live in labor camps. As I'm sure many of you know, North Carolina has a very large number of farm workers who come both through the federal H-2A program on visas, and also workers who live here either seasonally or year-round, but are in the U.S. on a more permanent basis. And many of those workers live in migrant labor camps. The difficulty for those workers and the way that living in a migrant labor camp can contribute to human trafficking is that the employer or the crew leader typically controls that labor camp, controls access in and out, and it makes it difficult for service providers to visit workers and provide them with necessary information about their rights and their ability to leave a trafficking situation. It also makes it hard for workers themselves to reach out for assistance. And so I'm going to talk about 3 different ways that North Carolina could improve the situation for people who live in migrant labor camps and reduce the demand for labor trafficking by doing that. I imagine many of you are aware that there have been court cases around access to labor camps, and they're generally favorable and say that both that farm workers have the right to have visitors because they are tenants, sort of like in a landlord-tenant situation, even if they aren't paying rent. There are some court cases that say that, and then there are others that talk about their First Amendment rights to free speech and to associate with people who come to visit them. And some cases also deal with the rights of the visitors themselves to access the labor camps. But relying on a court decision to establish access is tricky for service providers and for farm workers themselves, because it's not something that you can show a person who's trying to interfere with that access. You can't pull out a court case. Well, you could, but it wouldn't be very effective to pull out a court case and hand it to, say, a farmer who's saying, you need to get off my property. It's much more effective if there's something simple that you can provide that establishes that right of a visitor, such as a human trafficking organization, anti-human trafficking organization, religious provider, legal services, anyone else who might help to interrupt that trafficking relationship or help to, by their presence, deter people from holding others in a trafficking situation. Anything that they can use would be useful. And so the three things that I believe that North Carolina could do a better job on are establishing a broad attorney general opinion that could be used by service providers and by workers to show their right to have visitors. Letters from individual sheriffs or sheriff's association, or policies from those sheriffs that establish the rights of workers to have visitors and that it's not a trespassing situation. And then statewide legislation. So I'll start with the Attorney General opinion letter. In 1998, the North Carolina Attorney General issued an advisory letter to some legal services attorneys who had been threatened with arrest after visiting a client at a migrant labor camp. And that letter said that, that there were three grounds, similar to the grounds that I mentioned when I was discussing the court cases, that would establish the right for farm workers and their visitors to see one another at labor camps. That it was unlikely that it would be considered a trespass under the law for a service provider to visit a migrant labor camp, that farm workers and their employers who own the labor camp are in a landlord-tenant relationship, and that the First Amendment also would support the right of farm workers to have visitors. The letter was in the context of visiting an H-2A labor camp, although luckily the letter does say that status of the workers doesn't necessarily matter, that this opinion could apply to other types of labor camps where there are workers without H-2A visas. And it was in the context, again, of legal services attorneys and not other types of service providers. It also said that the workers must invite the service provider onto the labor camp in order for the service provider to have access or to have a legal right to access. In 2020, there were issues related to health officials, health personnel visiting labor camps to provide COVID prevention and COVID treatment services. And the Attorney General, Josh Stein, issued a new advisory letter that was specific to healthcare professionals, saying that they have the right to enter labor camps with the workers' consent and that the employer cannot bar access. And citing again to the landlord-tenant relationship between the camp occupants and the employer, the First Amendment, and then the need to protect public health. So again, this is a very helpful letter, but for a limited set of circumstances. So, our recommendation would be that there needs to be a broad Attorney General advisory letter that applies to all types of service providers and all types of workers who live in migrant labor camps. And in other states, there have been attorney generals who have issued opinions that have a variety of different types of stipulations on them. And so this is just a list of some of those different opinion letters, and you can see the different ways that attorneys general have crafted these opinion letters. But the broader, the better, I think, in terms of preventing demand for human trafficking. Second way that North Carolina could help to reduce demand for human trafficking in a migrant labor situation is through the use of policies and memoranda from North Carolina sheriffs. And I'm aware of two sheriff departments that have issued such opinions, Bladen County being the most recent in 2018, which stated that the Bladen County Sheriff's Office wishes to encourage farm workers to seek the protection of law enforcement and to obtain needed assistance, including through visits by service providers such as legal aid. It's a very helpful language, and I think it shows, the awareness of the coercive relationship that can be present in a migrant labor camp. Johnston County's letter is much older. It's from 1985 and refers again to these different legal grounds for farm workers to be able to have visitors at their labor camps. But the more sheriff's offices that are willing to issue such memos, I think the better, both for service providers to be able to present it to a grower who is confronting them in a visiting situation, and just for the awareness to spread among law enforcement that that this is a situation where they should be encouraging access to visitors and not discouraging what growers tend to characterize as trespass. And then the third way that North Carolina could reduce demand and improve migrant labor access is through legislation. We did introduce a bill in North Carolina in 2013. It did not pass, and as far as I know, there has not been attempts since 2013 to introduce such legislation, but it's much needed. And other states do have laws on the books that protect the right of access. Florida being the state closest to North Carolina, that states that migrant camp residents can have invited guests into their private living spaces, and that any other authorized visitors, even if they're not invited by a particular farm worker, can access common areas like a kitchen. Generally would be the common area that we would be talking about. That type of legislation would also be very useful in North Carolina. And so again, just to go over those recommendations again, North Carolina should pass legislation that guarantees access to authorized or invited visitors. County sheriffs should issue letters stating that they will not arrest visitors for trespass. And the Attorney General should update their access letter to provide the broadest possible access to various types of service providers and in various types of visiting situations for a broad range of residents of labor camps. Thank you. I will stop sharing and turn it back over to Pam.
Thank you so much, Carol. That was really helpful. I think a lot of us don't think about the labor camps and the need for service providers to access them. So that was really helpful. And last but certainly not least, I invite Christine Long, who is the Executive Director of our North Carolina Demand Reduction Task Force, who is the Executive Director of our Human Trafficking Commission, to share her thoughts with us.
Thank you. Thank you for having me. Thank you, everyone who's taken time to be on here today. I was going to tell you a little bit first about the Human Trafficking Commission. Some of you are probably aware of the commission, but we were created by the General Assembly in 2012. And the commission is housed in the Administrative Office of the Courts with 15 appointed commissioners that come together for meetings and discussion and moving the charges that the General Assembly gave us forward. When the commission was created, they were charged with engaging and combating human trafficking efforts across the state, kind of organizing efforts, recommending policies, training, awareness, that kind of thing. And so if you do want to learn more about the commission or get our emails about our public meetings, and I did put our website in the chat. I'm happy to put my email in there as well after this. But when talking about, I'm really glad that we have the Demand Reduction Task Force and that they have spent 2023 kind of examining and looking at labor trafficking. When we talk about a comprehensive plan for labor, it really does need as much pre-thought and planning and research as has been done on combating sex trafficking in North Carolina. And so these discussions are really helpful. And I spent some time thinking, and I have two main thoughts, although there's lots of different items we could discuss about reducing demand for labor. But the two I wanted to bring up today, one of them is exploring what options might be out there as far as incentives for employers and businesses to put more time and effort to caring about labor exploitation, educating them more on labor exploitation. And sometimes we find when that kind of positive incentive programs are put in place, people can actually change their minds on certain things and see things differently, especially when education is provided about what's happening across the state with labor and what different situations and scenarios we see and what they can look like. So that's one of my first thoughts, because a lot of people, when we talk about human trafficking, just automatically default to sex trafficking. And so constantly bringing up and bringing labor trafficking to the forefront of people's minds gets us into having that discussion a little bit more. And I think that fuels a lot of healthy conversation about steps forward, like these webinars have been doing. So my second thought with looking at a comprehensive plan for labor and what should be included is a lot of what ties into some of what Trent and Carol have just said. You know, when we look at different industries that we have in the state, if we can dig in a little more to examining what regulations there are that can maybe, well, what regulations there are in general, and then what enforcement there is for those regulations on those industries. And so I think when we can examine more of those in detail and see what exists out there, what is working and what might not be working, or areas that more can be done. Sometimes even comparing those ideas to other states, we can learn from other states on things they've done and success that they've seen. And so I would love to see a couple of those things be in any kind of trafficking. I can give you, I guess, to get into a little more detail. I know that Trent and Carol have talked a lot about exploitation in farm labor and agriculture, but when we look at labor trafficking, there are so many industries where we see tips and reports and situations. And one of those, for example, is our substance abuse treatment facilities in the state that there aren't a lot of regulations for. And so we see areas and times where vulnerable populations can be exploited. Businesses or nonprofits, even if they're nonprofits. So I know, I think yes, some other examples I had, we see labor-related tips and cases in businesses like could be nail salons, labor-related cases in massage businesses, factories, and different industries across the state, construction that we've seen tips in. And these different cases can involve foreign national potential victims or domestic potential victims. And so, it does take a little bit of research and planning to look into kind of what Carol has done about looking into what's been put out there. Do these different memos and letters match in what they're saying can be legally done? Or do they contradict each other in places? And can we help flesh out any of those systems to make them work more productively for labor? So that was all I had, Pam. I'm going to turn it back over to you to see if there's more questions or follow-up.
Thank you. I appreciate that, Christine. So let me take a look. There are no questions, but luckily I have some. So, I wanted to ask Christine, since you were last, I'll ask you, are there any plans to address demand reduction from the commission as part of the work that y'all are doing?
So far with the commission, we don't have, we had started on launching a strategy and even contracted with somebody to do comprehensive planning. And then also, not a bad thing, but then we were given a large amount of grant funding to issue out across the state that we did not know was coming and did not have staff for. And so we have spent the majority of the last year and a half getting those pieces in place to issue out that money, monitoring that money, and hope to get back to a point to where we can revisit that strategic plan and yeah, we just re-engage in those efforts, because we have throughout the years had different presentations to the Commission on Labor Trafficking. We've had presentations on continued presence and problems with that system, different types of labor trafficking. We've highlighted different cases that have happened. So we have put a lot of attention towards it when we can, but a comprehensive statewide strategic plan would be really terrific.
Wonderful. Thank you. And yes, thank goodness for all that money that flowed in to assist with human trafficking, anti-human trafficking efforts in our state. But it takes a lot of folks to manage all that. So yeah, thank you for that. I'm going to invite folks to be putting in questions in the Q&A as I get my questions answered. So Carol, this idea of access to labor camps, like I said, I think is probably something that a lot of people probably haven't given much thought to. Have there been times when, folks from various legal services or other providers have gone to these labor camps and, is it a simple case of, no, you can't come in, or have they actually been, assaulted? Or can you tell us a little bit about, what has happened in North Carolina?
Sure. It's a range. I mean, there are a lot of labor camps in North Carolina where there are large no trespassing signs as you enter the labor camp. And so that in and of itself is certainly a deterrent to certain service providers. But in terms of confrontations, that unfortunately has happened. That is what led to the 1998 Attorney General opinion, where someone from Legal Aid of North Carolina had gone to visit an injured worker at a camp who had called them asking them to visit and was confronted by a sheriff. We've had my colleague, attorney, who was blocked in at a labor camp when the grower showed up and said, we're not, you're not supposed to be here. But then ironically, put his truck across the exit so that they couldn't leave, and said, I'm calling the sheriff. And they were like, well, I guess we'll call the sheriff because we can't leave if you don't move your truck. So it's those kinds of situations that can be super intimidating to workers when they see, they see law enforcement show up, the grower, their boss, the grower, show up very angry oftentimes. And so we try to avoid those situations, of course, but that in itself is problematic. So I think, we, by having some more established and clear tools out there to show the right of access, I think that would help in getting those no trespass signs down, removing locked gates to labor camps, which we also see, which is highly problematic, and helping workers feel more confident that they have the right to ask people to come and see them if they want to.
Mm-hmm. Yes, I think the most disturbing thing that you just said to me, I guess I can accept that the farmers or the contractors would block people from coming, but the sheriff, that's disturbing. So what I gather from that is that training is needed for law enforcement. The tools that you mentioned are good, but that once things have already escalated, I guess showing that piece of paper might not be the best thing. So if we could have kind of do a preventive thing of educating law enforcement that these labor camps can't have these trespassing signs, that they can't forbid people and that the people you should be defending are the people trying to get in, not the people trying to keep folks out.
Yeah, I
So,
think that's really critical. I think, I mean, you make an excellent addition to my list of recommendations is training for law enforcement, not just on the legal right of workers to have visitors or service providers to make the visits, but also on the importance of for their law enforcement purposes. They want to have light shed on things that are happening in those labor camps so that they can adequately enforce the law and help people to get assistance if their rights are being violated.
of course. Christine, I think you had a question.
I did, Carol. I was curious if the sheriff's memo from Bladen County, I saw that one and was 2018. I was curious if that was the result of one of the hurricanes that I know flooded that area, and that, a lot of times we've seen in natural disasters where farm workers don't know that they can leave if their camp is being flooded, or aid staff don't know that they can go in and offer help to the workers. And so I was just curious if you knew if that was what it was from.
That's a really interesting question. I actually don't recall what led to that opinion being issued or that memo being issued, but I wouldn't be surprised if there was a connection. And you're absolutely right that natural disasters are a time when it's critical for people to be able to get in and out for their personal safety, obviously, and for the safety of the emergency personnel as well.
Trent.
Yes.
You had mentioned that you had 3 suggestions, and I was truly listening very hard, but I only caught 2. I caught that law enforcement should be trained to understand that, victims should be protected and not arrested or deported.
Yeah.
And that there need to be services for victims so they'd feel safe so that they could report. What was the first one?
The first one was, of course, barring or stepping up enforcement. So increased penalties for those who violate the law, who engage in trafficking, such as debarment of businesses that engage in trafficking, or suspension of their licenses, as well as increased fines. But I think the fact that many agricultural employees in specific have been cited for violations and then go out and either reincorporate or stay in the same business and continue operating, and then are found to have committed yet another violation is particularly troubling.
Yes, and in fact, we recently had a case here in North Carolina where the Federal Department of Labor subjected a farmer to fines and said that they couldn't, participate in the H-2A system for 2 years, but they had already done that to them previously. So I mean, it was exactly what you just said. I mean, they'd already been forced to not participate for a couple of years, and then came back and violated the terms again. So, so I was interested in knowing, I think you mentioned this when you were speaking. So that was the Federal Department of Labor that did this. I mean, the North Carolina Department of Labor, I would assume, would have the authority to do the same thing.
Well, although I do have a case in North Carolina currently, I'm not a member of the North Carolina State Bar, and I don't regularly practice in North Carolina. But maybe that's something that Carol can comment on, because she's been working in North Carolina and representing clients here for several years.
Sure. So the North Carolina Department of Labor doesn't have the same power that the Federal government does to bar people from operating as crew leaders in North Carolina. There has been discussion in the past about establishing a North Carolina crew leader registration system that could potentially allow for debarment from North Carolina if they violated the terms of our state system, but we don't currently have a system like that. And so there's not a way for the North Carolina Department of Labor to take that action.
Thank you. Thank you. Trent, you mentioned that you are working on a case in North Carolina now. Is there anything about that you can share with us?
Yeah, I certainly can comment on the details which are public, but this is a trafficking case, and we have made several allegations under the federal Trafficking Victims Protection Reauthorization Act, you know, this involves a plaintiff who had to escape in the middle of the night because he was consistently abused and threatened with deportation if he was going to leave his employment, or if he objected to his working conditions. You know, thankfully he was able to escape this situation because he had a family member that he knew, although it was not in North Carolina, but lived in the United States, who was able to arrange for means to kind of evacuate him from his trafficking situation. So, you know, he was one of approximately 20 others who were brought to North Carolina under an H-2A visa, and then were subjected to horrific working conditions. That were not just horrific by themselves, but they're fraudulent and misrepresentations of the actual work that he had expected to perform when he came to the United States.
So you said he was H-2A, so
yes,
this was agricultural.
Yes.
Are you at liberty to say what type of crop or what kind of work?
They were engaged in a variety of crops, harvesting tobacco, I think cucumbers, but part of the complaint and allegations were that they were used, he and others were transferred to work in construction in violation of their visas, and in violation of the commitment that they had made to the workers about the working conditions that they were to be guaranteed, and the hours that they were going to be working. So those are kind of the more interesting details.
Mm-hmm. So were all 20 able to leave?
Well, I can't comment on the remaining because I don't know what the status were, but from what I know, if you're talking about leaving as in leaving their employment situation, I think he was the only one who escaped the situation. I think the others were too fearful or reluctant to either speak out, or did not have the opportunity to some other place to go. So they remained in their working situation, but I can't say that for certain because I only have details on what his situation was. But that, you know, further evidence is what I was calling for earlier, which is that there's a necessity to provide some sort of rehabilitation services or opportunity for people who escape trafficking situations, because if those are not available, and if you don't have a family member, or if you don't have a friend who's willing to put you up until you can get back on your feet, then, you know, you're at extreme peril if you leave your employment.
Yeah, and that goes to an issue, understanding, of course, that not all farm workers are male, but quite a majority of them are, that we have so few services available in North Carolina or anywhere else for male victims of human trafficking. You know, most of the service providers kind of focus on women, and even the ones who say that they assist males, they are not usually able to help them with housing. You know, the shelters are, to my knowledge, almost exclusively female. So that's a huge gap in services here in North Carolina, but I believe across the country. So thank you for pointing that out.
I would just jump in to sort of piggyback on that, Pam, that I think what that leads to is people putting themselves in harm's way once they've left as well. You know, we have had some female farm worker clients who left trafficking situations by asking a stranger in a laundromat to help them. And, you know, it worked out all right for them. They were lucky that they approached someone who was safe, but it so easily could have been yet another victimized situation. So yeah, it's really terrible.
Right. Okay. We have a comment in the chat asking what state resources are available to human trafficking agencies to provide awareness and assistance to victims of labor trafficking. Anybody want to take that one on?
Yeah, I can. Thanks, Jim, for that question. Of course, on our website, we do have a resource library that is also a resource directory on there as well, that provides some information. We have some ability to help provide training and resources. And a lot of the requests that we get for different training or awareness, if we're not able to help ourselves directly, then we connect with others. And I know agencies like Pam's agency is an agency that can also do those and provide those same exact things out there. And we definitely encourage more awareness around labor trafficking and more focus being put towards it.
Very good. I hope that answers your question, Jim. I was looking back at this article that I mentioned to see, about the Labor Department finding 2 North Carolina businesses. They were fined $139,000 when they underpaid farm workers and intimidated them by seizing their passports, which we know is very typical. Yes, and they were debarred, as I mentioned, for 2 years in 2020 for violating it, and now they're debarred again. They also, and as I understand it, this is really common, is that they don't have, like, the farm workers don't get pay stubs that explain to them exactly how much money they made and what any deductions were for. And that seems to be one of the issues with this. They were also charged for transportation to the labor camp, which under the H-2A program, the farmer or the labor contractor is supposed to pay for. They were supposed to be receiving $13.15 an hour. They were only paid $8. It's disturbing to see how people will treat other, more vulnerable people just because they can.
I'll add, Pam, to what you said about people coming, having paid their own costs to get to the United States, which is supposed to be a cost that's provided or that's paid for by the employer. What happens is people also often are paying recruitment fees, which are very expensive in their home country, and then they arrive in debt with you know, the expectation that they're going to be earning money in the US to pay that back. And then when that doesn't happen, or even if they are being paid correctly once they get here, the need to stay in the trafficking situation is so great because of that looming debt that sometimes involves threats to their family back at home, or the potential loss of their land, their family's land. And so it's very coercive.
Mm-hmm. And of course, the fee that you mentioned is illegal.
Right.
It's illegal to charge a recruitment fee.
But very, very common.
Right. Right. And, you know, I am personally aware of at least one case, and I feel sure there are others, where, you know, the employer is supposed to provide a kitchen. And in this particular case, the employees were promised that there'd be a kitchen. When they got there, the kitchen was locked and not available to them. And they were charged $9 per meal. So in addition to, you know, the things we've already talked about, this charge for the transportation. So yeah, they're racking up this debt, and they didn't have work immediately available. So they were not working immediately, and, you know, had $200 transportation fee. And then, you know, they were only providing 2 meals a day. So it was $18 a day for the meals. And so that's adding up. And yeah, it gets bad. But I wanted to go back to something that Christine mentioned. She was talking about incentives. And I'm not aware much about business incentives. I recently, just this year, became aware of a program called the Gold Star Program. And I wonder if Christine, either you or Carol, want to share a little bit about that.
I could share a little bit. I didn't have that pulled up to share a lot about, but our North Carolina Department of Labor, I don't know what year it was, but it's been around for quite a while. They implemented a Gold Star program for agriculture. And it has to do with, you know, Carol's talked a little bit about what needs to be provided by the grower or the farmer or the association that brought the H-2A workers. And then what this program does is for farmers and growers that go above and beyond those minimum requirements, they consider awarding them this Gold Star status. I believe it's an annual thing. It's at a dinner that the awards are given, and they're listed on the website as being a Gold Star grower. And after, I think, a certain number of times that they receive that status, then there are incentives for them that may not necessarily be the best things for what we're talking about here. But from my understanding is that after so many times of receiving Gold Star status, their housing is no longer inspected. And so they can then take on more of the responsibilities themselves and making sure their housing is proper and they're providing the proper things. So I don't think that program was necessarily implemented as a way to reduce labor exploitation, but it is kind of that concept of having incentives for growers or farmers or the associations that perhaps could go to other businesses and industries as well, something similar where it incentivizes doing more than the minimum. And I don't know, Carol, do you have anything you can add to that you know more about it?
No, I think you've covered it. I mean, I think on the one hand, it has rewarded some growers who really have provided stellar housing, unusually nice housing to their employees. On the other hand, we do have this concern about people not being inspected on a regular basis, even if they have a history of being a good employer. It still can be troubling. Things can change from year to year. So I think it's a double-edged sword.
Yeah, I can see that. And it sounds like from the farmer's perspective, you know, if I show you several years that I'm doing it right, then you'll get out of my hair, basically. But yeah, I think
and that's kind of the, you know, Pam, that's kind of the balance of doing incentive programs, I guess. You have to have some incentive for people to want to do it and to put in the extra effort. But I think those conversations are worth having, you know, and you talk to some of the growers that Carol just mentioned that do provide terrific housing and do it very well. And the relationships they build with their H-2A workers, and they know them and they bring them back every year. And, you know, I've met employers of H-2B workers in the construction agency that are the same way, that have, that they know their workers' families, and they know their stories. They've brought them for a decade or more. They, you know, they support their families in the countries they come from, and have built such great relationships. So to some extent, I think when we highlight some of those really positive experiences and stories, in a way, I hope that incentivizes others, right? That there's so much more they could be doing that is beneficial to them too. So.
Very good. So I guess one thing I would like to do, unless someone else has a question, which I haven't seen that, is I'm going to just kind of look back at my notes and just kind of state what the what you all have said are elements that need to be a part of a comprehensive statewide plan. And so I'll start with Trent. More enforcement. You know, the number that he said that really grabbed me is that only 1% of farms are ever investigated, or ever inspected, either on just a regular inspection or because there was a report. 1%. Oh my gosh. And that the very, very, very few that are investigated, over half of them have at least one violation. I mean, those are impactful numbers. His second suggestion was that law enforcement should be trained to understand that victims shouldn't be arrested or deported. And, you know, just to put a little, to make that a little clearer, you know, what we're talking about is when a farm is raided, you know, we've all seen stories of, you know, hundreds of farm workers being arrested and deported because they were working there without the proper visa. And then in that same story, you never heard of what happened to the farmer who was employing all these undocumented workers, nor how they were being treated. So what he's talking about is, instead of going in and deporting all the workers, is investigating how they get there, how are they being treated, and to put the arrest on the employer and not the victims there. His third suggestion was to be sure that we have services for victims so that they feel safe and are stable enough to feel comfortable reporting and cooperating with law enforcement. And then Carol talked about access to labor camps. And she talked about 3 different things that can help with that. One is having an opinion letter from our North Carolina Attorney General. Another is having a letter or a memo from the sheriff of that county that says, among other things, we're not going to, it's not trespassing if service providers come onto this property. And then the third thing, to have legislation that clearly states that farm workers can have invited guests, and that authorized or invited visitors can come onto the property, can have access. And as we were talking, we came up with a fourth one, right, Carol, that we think law enforcement needs to be trained about that, about the legality of that. And then Christine talked about having incentives for employers to motivate them to want to do the right thing, and to educate, that possibly simply educating some of them might be all that's required. And her other suggestion was that we review the regulations that we currently have in place, and see what the enforcement level is on those, and see what's working and not working. So I think all of those are just really positive recommendations, and important that we take a look at all of those as we're trying to put together a plan. I'm going to share my screen because there's a couple of things I wanted to. There we go. We went through this. We saw Christine. We've gone through questions. So I just kind of wanted a minute to put all this together for everybody. You know, we did an introductory thing to start with. We always want to get a survivor's perspective on, you know, anything that we're talking about regarding human trafficking. And then tried to make it really real, bringing it down to the you know, to a grocery store level. And during that also talking about, you know, farms and farm workers to talk about responsible supply chains. And then today, of course, putting it all together as we think about creating a plan. I hope that those of you on this call, if you haven't already, will take a look at this website. It describes more about what the North Carolina Demand Reduction Task Force does. There's a list of teams on there that are working on various aspects of this plan. And one of them is labor trafficking. And if this is something that you are interested or feel called to, I hope you'll take a look at that and shoot us an email and let us know that you're interested in serving on one of those teams. We'd be grateful to have you. A couple of upcoming events that we have. Our law enforcement engagement team has planned a training for law enforcement at Wake Tech in February. And the purpose of this training is to learn how to do a reverse sting operation. And just for clarity, what that means is this is a law enforcement operation that would arrest sex buyers and not arrest prostituted people. So that is from a demand reduction perspective, that we reduce demand by enforcing laws against sex buyers. I'm going to put a link in the chat so that you'll have that. And I just ask you to please share this with any folks you know in law enforcement. And if you'd be willing to call your local police chief or sheriff and let them know about this, when they hear it from one of their constituents, that's a lot more valuable than hearing about it from me, I assure you. And the other thing that we are so excited about on the Demand Reduction Task Force is our upcoming conference, which is going to be in Raleigh in May at the McKimmon Center. Excuse me. So we are going to be talking about all different ways, strategies for prevention and demand reduction for both labor trafficking and sex trafficking. We will have speakers, expert speakers from here in North Carolina and from other states. And because you have registered for this webinar, we will be sure to send you the link just as soon as we have the registration site ready. So hope that you will be interested in that. And here's our website again. So I'm going to stop sharing. Thanks, Nikki, for putting that in. And I said I would put apologies, I'm trying to find the link for the training. I am having technical difficulties. There we go. Thank you again, everyone, for coming. We will be sending a follow-up email to this with information about these upcoming events and with links to all 4 of the webinars so that you can watch them if you missed any of them, and also so that you can share them with your colleagues. I want to say a huge thank you to Carol and Christine and Trent for giving up their time and sharing their expertise with us. We are so grateful to have all of you with us here today. Thank you all for coming. Have a great day.